What does it mean when the exhibition built to showcase your country's industry is dominated by the competitor accused of hollowing it out? The same overcapacity crisis pushing China out of America is flooding into Indonesia's own factories instead. In this episode, we look at how Southeast Asia's biggest economy is winning the export numbers game while losing its domestic industrial base at the exact same time. Act 1. The trade show selling Indonesia its own undoing. That question hung over Jakarta's biggest textile and garment trade fair this year. When you walk the floor of an industry showcase, you expect to see local manufacturing strength on display. Instead, the floor told a completely different story. At Intertex in Jakarta, most of the thousands of booths belong to Chinese companies selling the machines that make fabric, from spinners and dyers to knitters and printers. Local sellers put the problem plainly. Harry, who sells textile machinery to local Indonesian factories, noted that the market is simply not good because there is no money, largely because so many finished products are coming in directly from China. Harry's complaint sits inside a strange contradiction in Indonesia's economic data. In the second quarter of 2026, the country's economy grew 5.29% year-on-year, beating forecasts. Yet in that same stretch, over 32,000 Indonesian workers lost their jobs in the first half of the year alone, contributing to a wave that has cost more than 254,000 workers their livelihood since 2023. Growth and layoffs are rising together in the same industry. Act 2. 16 years of a widening gap. The relationship between these two economies dates back much further than this year's headlines. To understand why cheap goods are flooding the domestic market today, we have to look back 16 years to a trade deal that was supposed to bring mutual prosperity but ended up creating a structural imbalance. Indonesia and China signed the ASEAN China Free Trade Area Agreement in 2010, cutting tariffs between the two economies in the hope of mutual growth. 16 years on, that trade has turned distinctly lopsided. The framework was meant to open doors for both sides, but the nature of what flows across the border has fundamentally shifted over the last decade and a half. In 2024, Indonesia imported $72.7 billion worth of goods from China, mostly telecoms equipment, computers, and machinery. It exported back $62.4 billion, mostly coal, palm oil, and raw materials. Indonesia sells China the ground, and China sells Indonesia the machine. As tariff walls in the United States and Europe close off China's excess capacity, that output redirects into ASEAN's domestic markets. Textiles are not the only place this pattern shows up. Indonesia's smartphone imports from China nearly tripled between 2022 and 2025, even under local content rules meant to build a domestic phone industry. Textiles lead the headline simply because the sector still employs the most people on the factory floor, making the human pressure hardest to ignore. For a mill owner in Bandung watching Chinese-made fabric undercut Indonesian-made cloth by half the price, a free trade agreement signed in 2010 reads very differently today than it did on paper. When foreign production costs sit at half your baseline, standard market competition breaks down. Act 3. The safeguards that couldn't hold. Indonesia has tried to fight back through policy and regulatory intervention. But setting up trade barriers on paper is one thing. Stopping the physical flow of underpriced goods across a vast archipelago is something else entirely. The government imposed safeguard duties, which are temporary import restrictions on fabrics, yarns, fibers, and finished garments. However, these measures have had limited effect because China's sheer scale and low production costs cancel out the extra tariffs. On top of that, some Chinese textiles enter illegally and get rebranded as locally made, avoiding the duties altogether. Redma Gita Wirawasta, who chairs the Indonesian Filament Yarn and Fiber Producers Association, has been blunt about where the real fight lies. He stated that the flood of cheap imported goods is the core problem, and controlling both legal and illegal imports is the only real solution for domestic survival. The damage is not confined to large, publicly listed manufacturers. Indonesia's traditional weaving industries, including batik producers and handloom operators, are competing directly against mass-produced Chinese fabric that undercuts handmade cloth on price. Smuggling and illegal imports threaten hundreds of thousands of workers, from national factories down to a single loom in a family workshop. Indonesia is not the only country absorbing this overflow. Vietnam faces 4 to 5 million low-value parcels arriving daily from Chinese sellers via e-commerce worth nearly $2 billion a month. In Thailand, 4,300 factories closed over 2 years across furniture, electronics, garments, autos, and steel, a trend flagged by the Bank of Thailand. 3 different countries, 3 different entry points, but the exact same underlying pressure. China's excess capacity does not need every border post to be open. It only needs a single door to remain unlatched for the flood to enter the wider regional economy. Act 4. A state-sized bet against a state-sized problem. Run the adverse chain forward and the picture for local industry is bleak. When private manufacturers begin to collapse under import pressure, the state is forced to step in with interventions of unprecedented scale. West Java has absorbed the largest share of layoffs nationwide. Stritex, once one of Southeast Asia's largest textile makers, collapsed into bankruptcy in 2025, taking 11,000 jobs with it. Footwear maker Feng Tai placed 4,000 workers on leave in June 2026 alone. If job losses keep climbing, household spending, Indonesia's biggest growth driver, will weaken too. In January 2026, President Prabowo directed sovereign wealth fund Danantara to build a new state-owned textile company from scratch. Backed by $6 billion, the goal is to scale exports from $4 billion today to $40 billion within a decade using new machinery, modern technology, and zero legacy debt. However, this massive bet carries serious risks. Siwaj Dharma Negara of the ISES Yusof Ishak Institute warned the new state company could end up competing against the small and mid-sized manufacturers it is meant to protect. Economist Eko Listianto questioned whether building an entirely new entity rather than supporting private manufacturers already fighting to survive is the right tool. There is a third path running alongside both chains. Some manufacturers are not waiting for state intervention or safeguard duties. They are investing directly in automation and digital production software to cut waste and guesswork. It is a narrow route open mainly to well-capitalized firms, splitting the industry between those who can automate out of the squeeze and those who cannot. Neither chain is settled. What is already certain is that both the optimistic push for modernization and the adverse wave of factory shutdowns are unfolding inside the same industry, in the same country, at the exact same time. Act 5. Winning and losing the same trade war. 2 episodes ago, we covered how Cambodia and Indonesia were gaining ground as civilian garment exporters while new American tariffs punished Vietnam. That story remains true, but looking at national export totals alone leaves out half the picture. Indonesia's apparel exports to the United States are genuinely increasing. At the same time, its domestic textile industry is genuinely shedding tens of thousands of jobs in the same province. Winning the export numbers game and losing the domestic industrial base are not mutually exclusive. They are happening simultaneously. That is the blind spot in the standard China plus one narrative. Chinese factories are not simply stepping aside to let ASEAN take over. While export data at the front door shows regional triumph on Western store shelves, Chinese overcapacity is entering through the back door into ASEAN's own consumer markets. Textiles show this pattern first because the sector employs the most workers with the least margin to absorb shock quietly. But the same mechanics apply anywhere Chinese overcapacity meets an ASEAN industry finding its footing, from smartphones to steel. The export headline and the domestic reality can point in opposite directions for years because only one makes the official press release. What does it mean to win a trade war if the same industry can be both growing and disappearing at once? As regional supply chains continue to realign, that is the core question policymakers across Southeast Asia will have to answer. I am Hiro the Hornbill, and this is the ASEAN Angle. If this episode gave you a new way of seeing the region, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. New episodes weekly, link in the description.